In the center of Berlin, children play outside in a devastating final assault on the heart of the Third Reich. The Russian army closed in on the...
I stood next to the machinery room when I heard a shot. Very quickly. I ran away out of fear, but I immediately came back down from the upper bunker. Just then, they were wrapping Hitler in blankets.
His dream of a 1,000-year Reich. It lasted only a world. The Führer was defeated by the Allies, including a man once his partner, then his nemesis, a man who shared many of the same characteristics, Joseph Stalin. For 8 more years, until March the 3, when he died of a mother's problems with women and paranoia. Hitler was responsible for millions of deaths in the Holocaust. 6 million and hundreds of gypsies and homicides.
Phobic, object of persecution and attempts to kill him, and in the positive sense of believing that he had a sacred mission to save Germany and save the world.
Stalin murdered more than 20 million of his own people, political opponents and innocent victims whom he considered a threat.
He had schizophrenia.
How do you measure and explain such monstrous evil? One approach is a controversial new field of research, psychohistory.
All fields of social science that I could pull something from: psychoanalysis, behaviorism, social psychology, anthropology, sociology.
Described as an enigma, and he is an enigma in many ways. We think that by the use of science.
Born in the Georgian village of Gori on December the 21st, Djugashvili. 3 siblings had died before his birth, his deeply religious life to God. Joseph's father was an abusive alcoholic.
As a result of these early childhood experiences, he had a low self-esteem, what's typically called inferiority.
He never grew taller than 5 feet 4 inches, and his face was scarred. Hitler was also unhappy with his looks: low, retreating forehead, ugly nose, broad cheekbones, small eyes. Hitler didn't look. Both Hitler and Stalin suffered from inferiority complexes. Joseph was quick to lose his temper and harbored. Joseph's mother, Yekaterina, choir, hoping he... In 18's memory and talent for details impressed his... Finding the seminary life, Joseph turned away, became attracted to anarchism, terrorism, and... After 5 years in the seminary, for his revolutionary activities.
He might be described as a warfare personality. His whole life consisted in struggle against those whom he put down in his mind as enemies. He had what we might call an enemy complex.
Ten years after Joseph's birth, on April the 20th, 1889, when she gave birth to Adolf. Alois Schicklgruber, who later changed his name to Hitler, was a rigid, cold, strict disciplinarian.
And that kind of experience instills the belief that the German phrase, lebensunwürdige Leben, meaning living things that are unworthy to live. He classified large segments of the German nation as unworthy to live. And the idea...
When he was a boy, Adolf wanted to be a priest, and like Stalin, sang in the church choir. Hitler's father was the illegitimate son of an unmarried 42-year-old peasant woman who had become pregnant while working as a servant for a Jewish family. She never revealed who the father was. Hitler was obsessed with the thought that his paternal grandfather could have been Jewish.
What is important is what is established, that his grandfather was a Jew, so he
was considered egotistic, demanding absolute subordination from other pupils. He was a poor student, however, much more interested in becoming an artist. Again, in 1905, he dropped out of school, hoping to pursue an artistic career. He'd started writing poetry, at first romantic, then turning increasingly nihilistic, and surfaced during Joseph and Adolf's child years, was to become a driving force of their lives. Turned from a life of religion, active revolutionary, robbing banks and souls at gunpoint, to raise money to overthrow the Tsar. In 1910, Joseph chose a new name, Stalin, which in Russian means man of steel. Deported to remote rural areas in Siberia.
Shared exile with him, that he never took part in their social activities. He was always apart and bitter.
Of the Communist Party. Stalin had defined himself as a revolutionary, exactly what he wanted in life. Hitler, on the other hand, was still searching, and in 1907 moved to Vienna to pursue his artistic interests. He rented a tiny room here at 29 Stumpergasse. Living on a small inheritance controlled by his mother, he dreamed of entering the academy. But his dream was shattered when his mother, Clara, died 4 days before Christmas after a long and painful struggle with breast cancer.
Because he became non-functional, he was devastated by her death.
Two years in a row, Hitler applied to the prestigious Academy of Fine Arts, but was unsuccessful. Because he was unable to draw people, the Academy told him he had no aptitude for painting. He believed he'd been rejected because several were Jewish. His first exposure to Jews, Hitler became attracted to the racist rhetoric in anti-Semitic newspapers and pamphlets. It was during this period that he became intrigued by the idea of a pure German master race. After his rejection by the Academy and the death of his mother, Hitler was miserable in Vienna, lonely and poor, lacking direction. Finally, in 1940 of war, Hitler enlisted in the army and found his identity in battle, carnage, and death. For the first time in his life, Hitler was happy.
In his army service, Hitler was the happiest he was at any time in his life. The sanctioned killing that he was entitled to engage in as a soldier gave an outlet for the first time to the murderous rage that had grown in him.
And experienced his first real success in the Iron Cross.
Over and over, replenished and wiped out a belief that he was chosen by destiny for a magnificent.
When Germany signed the armistice on November the 11th, Hitler pledged to avenge the fatherland in his communists and the Jews. The pivotal year for Stalin was 1924. Fate intervened and provided an opportunity to seize power. That year, Lenin had suffered a series of strokes. Knowing his death was imminent, Lenin warned the party to beware of Stalin.
He saw that he was a problematic personality as the recognized supreme leader of the Bolshevik Party and therefore of the Soviet state.
Too late. Lenin and Stalin immediately began jockeying for power and intimidated potential rivals, using ruthless agents to do his dirty work.
The system of agents around political opponents was itself paranoid. The core, the center of the paranoia was Stalin himself, but he managed to recruit people who thought like him, people.
Stalin once said, to prepare every detail of the blow, to slake an implacable vengeance and then go to bed, there is nothing sweeter in the world.
The symptoms of paranoia appeared relatively early in mysterious circumstances. I should emphasize that this was not...
Before long, Stalin's paranoia and ruthlessness were to have profound not only for the peoples of the Soviet Union, the same cruelty and sadism that dominated his family life, especially his relations with his second wife, Nadia.
His relation to this particular woman was terrible. He abused her, both psychologically and physically.
Nadia had 2 children, a son, Vasily, and a daughter, Svetlana. Stalin had another son, Yakov, from his first wife, a strong peasant girl from Georgia. She had died of typhoid in 1907. Like his own father, Stalin humiliated and insulted his sons. Vasily became an alcoholic, and Yakov tried to commit suicide.
His abuse as a child was transmitted in the form of his abuse to his own children.
Nadia was a good mother, both to her own children and to her stepson, Yakov.
She was a member of a old Bolshevik family in Leningrad, and for him, he was one of the leaders of the revolution. And she looked up to him and had great...
On November the 8th, 1932, came furious and half-drunk, threw cigarette ends, and she got up and left, returning to their Kremlin apartment. Nadia was found dead, shot in the heart.
He either drove her to suicide or killed her himself.
Svetlana, her mother, Nadia, left Stalin a letter which was full of personal and political reproaches. He walked up to her coffin and then pushed it away. He never went to her grave.
While he both revered and
Extreme closeness to his... He grew up with what is an obsession with women and sex, together with extreme inhibition.
Important woman in Hitler's life was his younger niece, Geli Raubal, who lived with Hitler in his Munich apartment. He worshipped her and was extremely jealous of her relations with other men.
In general, Hitler treated Geli as he treated most people. Was a very spirited person, able to exert the degree of control over her that he...
While Geli was living with Hitler in Munich, she continued a relationship with a man in Vienna and became pregnant by him. Hitler's eyes was that the...
They was overheard, but they didn't know the content of it. And Hitler drove off to fulfill a speaking engagement out of town.
The next morning, Geli was found dead in Hitler's Munich flat, shot in the chest. Geli Raubal's death in 1931 remains a mystery. But there is little doubt that Hitler contributed to her tragic end. Meanwhile, Hitler had been seeing another... They met when Eva worked as a receptionist and model in the studio of Hitler's official photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann. This is how Adolf Hitler first appeared to the 18-year-old Eva, working in Hoffmann's darkroom. Eva became an ardent admirer of Hitler and was fascinated with Hoffmann's photograph.
Eva Braun quickly fell in love with Hitler. She wanted to marry him, she wanted to have children with him, those things.
Hitler considered Eva the ideal German woman, in his words, cute, cuddly, out publicly. Lonely and neglected, Eva confided in her diary.
The weather is so wonderful, and I, the mistress of the greatest man in Germany and in the world, to let me remain here, bowing. If I don't get an answer before, and gently fall asleep into another world. He has so often told me he is madly in love with me, but what does that mean when I haven't had a good word from him in 3 months?
She attempted suicide a couple of times, and one time he asked the doctor who came in after she tried to kill herself whether this was a genuine suicide attempt or only a trick to win his sympathy. The physician assured Hitler that it was a genuine attempt, and he was touched by that.
Hitler kept his distance from Eva and never displayed any public affection toward her. I am married to Germany. Hitler thought of the German who had to be controlled by a strict father, their Führer. He believed that it was his destiny to fulfill that role. But first, 30th, Hitler began his brutal dictator and paranoia. He set about creating a police state and used it to strengthen his political rivals and so-called enemies of the state.
Whoever knew how to read should have known where it would lead. National Socialism excluded all those who thought differently, locked them up, exploited them, and even murdered them in masses, simply because they did not want to succumb to the system.
Despite Stalin was morbidly suspicious and saw enemies as ends.
That he should be removed from the Secretary General role, thought that Kirov should be his...
At the 17th Party Congress, lavishly praised Stalin. Loved Kirov and knew he was loyal, but he had become too popular for Stalin's liking.
On December 1, 1934, in Leningrad, Kirov was assassinated. And from all that we know now, it seems beyond serious doubt that Stalin was responsible for this crime. And the murder of Kirov was the big terror.
Stalin attended Kirov's funeral and feigned grief at
killed, and then it went into the anyone who had had any contacts with the opposition. These were rounded up within days and were in jail, and some of them were shot immediately, and the purges just rolled on from there, to the point where they were shooting 1,500 to 2,000 people in Moscow alone in one day in the summer of 1937.
It has been estimated that during these and later purges, Stalin liquidated 20 million Soviet citizens as enemies of the... Members of his own Politburo were so afraid of him that no one dared. The applause would go on for so long that bells were... or imagined enemies, both literally and figuratively.
Take, for example, Trotsky. There is the famous photograph of Lenin giving a speech, Trotsky standing over on the other side of the platform. Later on, Trotsky just...
Images of those who had vanished.
The photographs and the retouching of the photographs just demonstrates a sort of like a second death.
For 30 years, photo historian David King has assembled one of the world's largest collections of photographs, posters and paintings from the Soviet era and documented Stalin's treachery.
And the second death is a death concerned with elimination from the media. Normally one has remembrance of the razors, scissors. The more aggressive the retouching, I think probably...
Like Stalin's case, his own. On March the 11th, 1938, greeted the Führer. But agenda. As Austria belonged to Hitler, he took steps to eradicate any suspicion of his Jewish...
to cover up the evidence of his past. And so, by doing so, he caused a lot of rumors and myths to be projected upon the blank space of the past that he tried to erase.
Power gave Hitler the opportunity to eradicate a whole village, the Austrian village of Dollersheim, a secret that haunted him for years. The Dollersheim registry held the birth certificate of his father, who Hitler suspected was the illegitimate son of a Jew. Hitler used the village as a firing range. Round after round of artillery fire crashed into the village, demolishing its building recognizable.
On this sort of ruined church with just some hollow walls standing, and it seemed to me in some sense of the historical record on Hitler's past.
by obliterating the bricks and motion of his own Jewish blood. Like Stalin, Hitler believed he was surrounded by enemies trying to betray him and that he needed to strike first.
Hitler grew up with the idea from his experience in his own family that it was probably necessary to kill if one did not want to be killed. He generalized this and divided people into predators and victims, and chose very deliberately to be a predator.
The predator's next victims were to be Jews. Hitler's obsession and secret plan was to liquidate all the Jews of Germany, Europe, and the Soviet Union under the cover of war. Hitler had long been to attack Russia. Now he was ready, and into a false sense of security, Hitler signed a non-aggression. The two most powerful dictators in the world eyes. On the morning of June the 22nd, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia. Two of Hitler's goals, the destruction of communism and the annihilation. The invasion started, not surprisingly, trade.
Stalin. And he was very disoriented as a result, and for the next thing, getting him to understand what was happening, and it wasn't for about 3 or 4 weeks that he finally pulled himself.
For the paper today, all are eager in deadly conflict with its most...
1940 was jubilant, ironically, of the end months later, in the city of his Soviet opponent. The Battle of Stalingrad was more men of iron. In 1942, the Germans launched an all-out land and air attack on the city. Stalin issued an order. Any soldier that surrendered would be considered a traitor. Retreating soldiers were shot.
The family members should be subject to repression. As it turned out, who was an officer, and this was his son Yakov,
was taken prisoner by the Germans.
Prisoner by the Russians. And some kind of a offer Yakov.
1 million men. After its defeat at Stalingrad in 1943, though Hitler was losing the war, he was still
hanging precariously in the balance on the Eastern Front. Hitler, given the choice between allocating troops and trains to revolt of Stalin's Red Army and allocating those troops and trains to carrying Jews to the death camps, Hitler withdrew troops and trains from these carry out the murder.
Increasingly dependent on amphetamines. Each morning, his personal physician, Dr. Chiritz, to sleep. As the war went on, the Führer became more... New information obtained from Hitler's med... He became increasingly paranoid. Or Hitler began to show symptoms of Parkinson's disease.
He trembled slightly, but if you are with someone every day, you don't notice this. And no one paid attention to every detail.
As the Red Army overwhelmed Berlin, Hitler was hiding deep inside the Führer bunker beneath the Chancellery. When Russian soldiers entered the bunker, they found several Nazi corpses. In the courtyard were the charred bodies of Eva Braun and Hitler. And an album of prized snapshots. Inside, a photo Hitler had been carrying with him all his life. His mother, Clara. Over the Nazis by parading long lines square to rally the Soviet. Many hoped a new era.
The American embassy. And on May 9, 1945, took place. Great bird in the streets of Moscow. People were dancing, and I read her, perhaps a major, said in Russian, "Now it's time to live."
The terror this time was directed against Jews and centered on a group of Jewish doctors, murder Soviet leaders, including him.
Were to be publicly executed on the Jewish population of the major cities were to be deported to eastern Siberia, with pogroms perpetrated against him en route.
Only his sudden death of a brain hemorrhage on March the 5th, 1953, prevented him from carrying out yet another purge. His daughter, Svetlana, recalled the scene as she stood by his deathbed.
He suddenly opened his eyes and cast a glance over everyone in the room. It was a terrible glance. Then something incomprehensible and awesome happened. He suddenly lifted his left hand as though he were pointing to something above and bringing down a curse on all of us. The next moment, after a final effort, the spirit wrenched itself free of the flesh.
Hundreds of thousands of mourners watched as Stalin was laid to rest in the mausoleum beside Lenin. For Adolf Hitler, no monument. And Joseph Stalin, cruelty, terror, and death, which changed the course of history